The reading today is taken from the book of Ruth, chapter 2, verses 2 to 9. One day, Ruth said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields to gather the grain that the harvest workers leave. I am sure to find someone who will let me work with him." Naomi answered, "Go ahead, daughter." So Ruth went out to the fields and walked behind the workers, picking up the heads of the grain which they left. It so happened that she was in a field that belonged to Boaz. Some time later, Boaz himself arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the workers. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the man in charge, "Who is that young woman?" The man answered, "She's the foreigner who came back from Moab with Naomi. She asked me to let her follow the workers and gather grain. She's been working since early morning and has just now stopped to rest for a while under the shelter." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Let me give you some advice. Don't gather grain anywhere except in this field. Work with the woman here. Watch them see where you are and reaping and stay with them. I have ordered my men not to lay a hand on you, and wherever you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars they have filled. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God."
Now, I have never before fought in a war. I've never been a member of the armed forces, although I have wondered once or twice about being a chaplain in the RAF because they've got nice uniforms. I've never been a policeman. I've never been a fireman. I've never been a doctor. Never been many of the things that we mentioned. I've worked for charities and churches and IT companies, and that's about it. So I'm not really very much of a guardian, am I? Not really. But one of the things I love about the book of Ruth is that she and Naomi were ordinary people, just like you and just like me. And they showed us how ordinary people can look after each other and protect each other. Now, I suspect that some of you, when you come home from school, might say something like, "I'm starving." Have you done that before you got home? "I'm starving, I want some food." Yes? One of you is on it, two of you is very honest, I suspect. I've certainly done that. Some of you grown-ups may have got home and thought, "Oh, I'm starving," and grabbed a snack or some crisps or a chocolate biscuit or something. Any grown-ups want to admit to doing that sometimes? One or two. Well, in a famine, people really are starving, because in a famine it means there isn't enough food at all. And that was the first problem that Naomi and her family had. There was no food, so they had to travel to a different country where there was food. Then Naomi's husband died, so she was a single mum with 2 boys. The boys grew up and they got married, and then her sons died. And after all that tragedy, Naomi decided to go back home. I think that makes sense to me, where her friends and some of her relatives would be, to a little town called Bethlehem. See what I did there? Little town called Bethlehem? Yeah, there you go, some of you. It's nearly Christmas. Ruth decided to go with Naomi all the way to Bethlehem to help look after her. And she did. So in a way, Ruth was a little bit like Naomi's guardian. Naomi couldn't go out to gather food, and in those days, most women didn't have jobs. So the only way women could get food if they weren't married or had a family was to beg for food, or to go into a field like Ruth did and pick up the bits of grain that the harvesters had dropped. It was called gleaning. That's what Ruth did to look after Naomi. She was Naomi's guardian. And then it was dangerous, you see, for women to do that, especially by themselves, in the field, all by themselves during the day. And it was really, really hot. Have you ever been in a really hot day where you're just really, really thirsty? I've been like that, and you just need a glass of water. Well, can you imagine working really hard in the sun without a hat, without a sunshade, just getting really, really hot all day? Well, that's what it was like. So Ruth, that's what Ruth was doing to look after Naomi. And that's where Boaz comes in. It just so happened that the fields that Ruth picked belonged to this man named Boaz. It just so happened that as Ruth was working in the field, Boaz arrived. It just so happened that when Boaz arrived, he spotted Ruth and saw what she was doing. It just so happened that he was curious enough to ask who she was and what she was doing. It just so happened that Boaz was a really nice guy. And it just so happened that he was so impressed with what Ruth was doing for Naomi, that he made sure nothing bad happens to her. Boaz was Ruth's guardian, and he just so happened to be a distant relative of Naomi's. That's a lot of coincidences, isn't it? Don't you think? That's a lot of coincidences. It's almost like through seemingly random events, even some awful things, it's almost like God was at work in the background being Ruth and Naomi's guardian. Now, in those days, there was a rule, might seem a little strange to us now, that if a man died, leaving behind a wife without any children, his closest relative would marry the woman to make sure she was cared for and to keep the family going. And that's what Boaz did. He didn't only make sure that Ruth was safe in his field, he didn't only make sure that she and Naomi had enough food. He then married Ruth, and they had a baby boy called Obed. I suspect none of you is called Obed. It's an unusual name. But the story has a happy ending. Except that's not the end of the story. It gets better because Obed had a son called Jesse. And Jesse grew up and he had a family and he had 8 sons. Can you imagine having 8 little boys in a family? Wow. Jesse had 8 sons. And the youngest son was called, anyone remember from the video? Yes? David. Wonderful, you were listening very well. And David grew up to be a shepherd. And what else was David? Can you remember as well?
He slayed Goliath.
He slayed Goliath, that's right. David grew up and he killed this massive giant, and then he was made king of Israel. But the story didn't end there either, because David had a great, lots of greats, son named Joseph. And Joseph married someone famous. Can anyone remember who Joseph married? Yes? Mary. Joseph married Mary. And Mary gave birth to Jesus. Isn't that amazing? This story of Ruth that you may or may not have heard before, Ruth lived about 3,500 years ago, because she looked after Naomi, and because Boaz looked after her, a family was born. And ultimately that family became Jesus' family. Jesus, who gave his life so we would have everlasting freedom. Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, they were ordinary people. They were like you and me. They weren't particularly special, but they loved each other and they cared for each other. They protected each other. They were guardians, not of the galaxy. They weren't guardians of the galaxy, but they were guardians of each other. And that's something we can be as well. We can look out for one another, we can love one another, we can care for one another, and we can protect one another. And through all that they were doing, God was at work looking after them. And he can be your guardian today as well. If you're interested in finding more about that, please come and talk to me afterwards. Amen.